Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us. I am going to give everyone a couple of minutes to log on and get situated in our room before we get started on tonight's session. So I just want to say welcome, and I'll give everyone a couple more seconds here. Thank you again for taking the time this evening to join us as we discuss tonight's session, Gap Year 101, Gapping in the COVID Era. Very important topic here. And we have some wonderful experts that I can't wait to introduce. And I'm really looking forward to our conversations tonight. Any questions that you have, if you have something in the back of your mind, definitely take note of that. You can drop any questions throughout the presentation in our Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So that is an option. And as everyone joins us, welcome in all. I will go ahead and get started. So my name is Kelly Daniels, and I am an event coordinator for USA Gap Year Fairs. And for the past 14 years, we've partnered with high schools across the country to educate, inspire, and empower students to think beyond the classroom and look for opportunities in experiential education. And so COVID has drastically, impacted a lot of our plans, but it's also really kind of, shifted students' perspectives. And some of these programs have come up to really innovative operations and programming for you all. So very excited to kind of dive into what gap time looks like during COVID. And this event is hosted by Go Overseas, and you can think of us as kind of like a Yelp, but for meaningful travel experiences. So we don't actually operate any of our own programs, but we're a great resource. So definitely check us out. You can read tons and thousands actually of reviews from alumni and programs alike. So definitely check us out at gooverseas.com. And I just want to mention the fact that we are giving away two pretty great, wonderful scholarships. And so these scholarships are eligible for US students and citizens who are ages 14 to 25. So if you haven't applied yet, please do. I will go ahead and drop the link for you now, just so you all have it. It really should only take a couple of minutes to get that application started. So definitely check it out. And I also want to point out that we do have a final gap year fair on March 30th, and we have 6 additional sessions that are theme specific. And so you can check us out on Wednesday to learn how to plan your gap year. You can follow up for gap year in the arts, internships, adventure programs. All of these sessions are coming up in the next couple of weeks. So definitely be sure to check up and register for future events. And I will actually drop that link for you also, because that's a really good resource to go ahead and register. And moving on, I want to introduce you to our wonderful experts. I want to say thanks again for joining us. We have Jason Soroyan here tonight, who is an accredited gap year counselor and co-founder of J2 Guides. We have Aaron Jensen, who is the campus director of admissions at WSU Vancouver. And we may have a student joining us named Molly, who has done a really cool gap year experience and traveled to Vermont and Hawaii during her gap year time. But she was having some technical difficulties, so she may or may not be here. We shall see. But again, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and pass the mic to Jason for his Gap Year 101 presentation. Thank you so much, Jason, for joining us, and welcome.
Thanks, Kelly, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I am Jason Soroyan. I'm one of the co-founders of J2 Guides, which is an accredited gap year counseling organization here in the United States. I'm so lucky to have spent the last 25 years working directly in experiential education, first cutting my teeth in my 20s as a gap year based program leader, then moving more into direct programming and starting to do design and program direction of gap year organizations. And now for the last 10 years, working specifically with gap year students to help advise them as a gap year counselor. I'm coming to you today to speak a bit about what gap year looks like during COVID-19. In 2020, we saw thousands and thousands of gap year students take gap time despite the threat of COVID-19. And now we've watched as programs have been able to pivot and refine their policies so that they can offer compelling opportunities in the fall of 2021 and beyond. And that's what we're going to cover tonight. One of the lenses I want to bring tonight is through the standards and accreditation Accreditation Committee, which is based out of the Gap Year Association. The Standards and Accreditation Committee is essentially responsible for all of the safety protocol and risk management that Gap Year programs will abide by in order to be an accredited program. And we've been looking a lot at COVID and how that impacts programming. So I'll put that hat on tonight as I speak with you all as well. But first, let's start with the good news, which is that students were gapping this last year, and they will be gapping again in the coming year. The gap year counselors in this country are working with hundreds of students, and there are thousands of students gapping on their own. And the great news is that lots of students took gap time this fall of 2020. They were all over the United States, and that's one of the biggest pieces of news that will probably differentiate 2021 gapping from 2020 gapping, is that while this last year, we had most students participating in programs and work exchanges, volunteering and internships here in the US, a lot of what we'll see in 2021 and 2022 is that students are going to be all around the world again. And that's an exciting thing. But the great news is that students were out and they were in the world. And the reason they were able to be out and engaged in these activities is because gap year programs worked really hard since essentially March of last year to pivot their programming so that students could come in and initially quarantine and then be masked for a period of time. And then once they passed over a period of time where they had their testing done, they were able to live and engage in unmasked lives, right? They were able to be on program essentially as a COVID podded family while in these different experiences. And I was just talking with a program today that's operating in Hawaii. They're about to step out of their period of quarantine together and move into life as you would normally know it pre-pandemic. They're able to engage with their community partners without masks on. They're able to be close together in physical proximity. And these gap year students are living the dream that we're all hoping to live again soon, which is just being able to be really close to one another. And that's exciting news for anyone who's looking to gap this coming year. We're looking forward to an extended amount of programming that will expand beyond even the amazing amount we saw earlier this fall. So one of the things we start with when we talk about gap year counseling is the reason why you want to take a gap year. And there are a lot of compelling reasons that students think about taking a gap year. And pre-pandemic, we would have seen many of the reasons cited here on this slide. The biggest one is that a lot of students feel burnt out. And frankly, I'd imagine that there is a lot of students who are feeling burnt out right now, probably for the same reasons that lots of students do every year, which is high school is challenging now. And we ask a lot of students. The college admissions landscape that Erin is going to speak to later on is very competitive. It's much more competitive than it was even say 10 years ago, certainly than it was 20 years ago. And students are working hard towards those college admissions. So a level of burnout is to be expected for many students. But now we're also seeing Zoom fatigue and the fatigue of just having been remote or hybrid remote for much of the last year. And lots of students are saying, hey, it'd be really nice to be out experiencing the world, getting my hands in the dirt, really participating in learning that's active and growth filled and in person. And so a lot of students are talking about taking gap year because they're ready for that. Whether they're ready to go on to college or not right now, they're excited to actually do some hands-on learning again, learning where they can apply all that knowledge. I've circled COVID-19 here because COVID-19 was a dramatic shift in the gap year landscape in this last year of gap time. We saw many, many more students who would never have been considering gap year, who were planning to go right on to college or right on to a trade school or to community college, consider gap time. And that shouldn't be surprising to anyone here. Many students are very clear on what they want their college experience to be. And many of them looked and saw that last summer as colleges were trying with the reopening plans to articulate what it was going to be like, I think they could read the writing on the wall that living in a dorm, but taking all of your classes remotely and having bag lunches dropped off at your room or picked up from the cafeteria, but not being able to go to football games, not being able to enjoy social clubs, not being able to go out and meet people in person, that's not what college will look like for a lot of freshmen. Erin's going to cover what the college landscape might look like this coming fall, but the reality is that colleges still aren't necessarily going to be able to welcome students fully onto campus in the same way that many of us as adults knew our college experience. And so COVID-19 has been a big driver for students to consider taking gap years. When we look at taking a successful gap year, one of the important terms that has come up, and I know that Aaron's going to cover this as well, is the idea of intentionality. Successful gap years begin with a level of intention. We're hearing that many students are considering not going on to college this fall because they're just going to wait it out until college looks exactly like the landscape that they want. But just sitting at home and doing nothing is not what we consider a gap year. That's just choosing not to go to college. Taking a gap year requires that you actually have some intentional thoughts of how you want to grow, how you want to learn, and ultimately what you want to get out of this time. In the United States, we look at gap years as being productive time, where you transition from your young adult life into your adult life in a really meaningful and ideally a structured way. When you build in the levels of intentionality, when you build in structure so that you have something meaningful to do day to day, when you build in levels of mentorship with adults that care about you and want to see you grow, and when you build in time around peers who are also going through that same experience, that's where we see successful gap years. Now, that means that you could stay and live at home if that's the right path for you and do something that's challenging. And maybe you're working and you're out in the working world. Maybe you're living away from home in an apartment for the first time and you're engaged in virtual studies or virtual learning experiences. Maybe you're joining one of the fantastic gap year programs that's offered out there in the world and you're in the US or you're going abroad, or maybe you're doing something else or a combination of all those things. But if you build in these four ingredients, this is where we've seen those intentional gap years really be successful for students. Now, when students do engage in gap year programming, and particularly during these pandemic times, we've noticed three program models that have really been thriving and allowing gap year students to thrive within them. And I want to just discern and help delineate these different program models because the subtleties aren't always clear to people when they're looking at them on the internet. So, of the facilitated gap year programs that are out there that offer you leadership and a cohort of peers, there's a few models that really stand out. One of them is the expeditionary learning model. And the reason why expeditionary learning has been doing really well in COVID and keeping students really safe from COVID cases is because oftentimes in these environments, you're way out in the middle of the field. So students will be camping, they'll live in an outdoor environment. They're separated from the risks of COVID-19 because once the group has coalesced and joined together in the beginning of their programming, they can then go through testing and quarantine. And once everyone is cleared, the group is essentially isolated by the sheer fact that they're just in an environment that's isolated. People aren't coming in and out of that environment, and people aren't leaving that environment to bring essentially COVID-19 back into it once they return. So this environment has been amazing for students. The program model that leads you out onto expedition has been great. But the exact opposite model has been really interesting and very successful in managing COVID-19 as well. We call these residential programs. Residential programs take place on one space in one piece of land where you get to know one landscape. Usually students are living together in a household and they explore farming or they explore the outdoor world, but they're sleeping, in a warm bed at night and eating warm food that they cooked in the kitchen in the daytime. There's several excellent program models that utilize this residential opportunity, and that allows students to, again, control the environment, control the in and out of people who are coming and going, and thus students can live in these potted family communities and living in more of an urban setting. And we've seen several really excellent residential models work well. If we're able to bring Molly on today, we'll be able to hear about her experience in a travel immersion program. Molly was a part of a program that traveled through the Pacific Northwest earlier this fall, and she had an amazing experience where she traveled through several states and was able to engage in lots and lots of different communities. The program has to go through great pains to make sure that students are tested regularly, that they are adhering to mask-based protocol when they're working with the other constituents and other community groups, but travel immersion programs have done really well. Not only in the United States, though, but we're also seeing travel immersion programs open up in certain countries, such as Ireland or in other places within the UK or certain areas of Europe. We're seeing excellent programming happen in Central America and South America right now. And we're also seeing opportunities open up in Africa as well. So travel immersion programs are probably going to be the biggest growth area for gap year come fall 2021. When looking at COVID-19, nobody has a crystal ball, but there are a few predictions that we might be able to make about how students will be able to travel, where they might be able to travel, and what might be expected of them. And so a few things to take into consideration is this fall, it's very likely that the amount of programming and the destinations that programs are going to will very much resemble what's happening this current spring for our current gappers, ones like Mali. So if we look at that situation for current gappers right now, there's a few things. Number one, US-based programming is what is kind of reigning supreme right now. It is a lot safer for students to travel around the United States in these different program models that I was articulating before than it is for them to go to a lot of other countries around the world. Part of that is just the transmission rate of COVID in some of these destinations of the world. Part of it is the available medical care that if a student did contract COVID, how they would be able to be cared for. And the other thing that programs are really focusing on is that in international destinations, student groups could be the carriers unwittingly of COVID-19, bringing them into communities that don't have a lot of resilience built in or have not had an opportunity to be vaccinated. And so you'll find this coming fall that while there will be some international destinations that will be available, it won't be as robust as what we'll see in what will be the winter and spring of 2022. Also, students who are thinking about traveling in the fall of 2021, please note that you will need a real ID to get on a domestic flight as of the fall of 2021. This is a mandate that was brought down almost a year and a half ago now, but it suggests that students can't just travel on a government issued driver's license. It needs to actually have real ID verification, and that's something that needs to be done in person. So everyone needs to prepare for that. You probably won't have to have a quote unquote COVID passport to travel this fall because not everyone will have had a chance to get vaccinated. And then finally, you should expect that programs that are in the gap year space will probably continue to have some kind of a pre-COVID quarantine, as well as an on-site COVID quarantine. Mask wearing will be ubiquitous for a period of time, as will testing on programs. So things are going to be very similar in the fall as they are currently right now for gappers. But in the winter of 2022 and the spring of 2022, moving into the summer, we're going to probably start seeing things open up a lot more. International program destinations will likely have much more availability of vaccine for their residents. Students in the United States, who are one of the last groups to get vaccinated here, will likely all have had a chance to get a vaccine if they wanted a vaccine. And we will probably start seeing that vaccine passport required for students who want to travel from this country into others, meaning that other countries won't allow us in unless we've been vaccinated or at the very least have a negative COVID test before traveling. And then finally, you should expect to see that programs will probably still need to institute mask wearing at certain points in their programming. So just note that if you're thinking about taking a gap year this coming year, starting in the fall of 2021, you will have to be mindful about COVID-19, but that the risks for students on program will probably remain very low, and that the number of hoops that you're gonna have to jump through to be able to be unmasked and really engaging in the communities is probably gonna go down as time goes on. Again, no crystal ball here, but that's what we're predicting based on everything that we're seeing. And then finally, for those of you who are thinking about taking gap time during this period where COVID-19 is very active, there's a few steps that we really want you to take. And it's really important, particularly the last step here. So of course, you're going to begin brainstorming and daydreaming about what you want to do. You're going to come up with your priorities and you're going to come up with your goals. Then through organizations like USA Gap Year Fairs and through Gap Year counselors and through lots of great sites on the internet like Go Overseas, you're going to begin doing your research, finding programs, finding experiences and opportunities that are a good fit for you. And that's step number 2. The big takeaway for us as Gap Year counselors and those folks who have been working with Gap Year students in planning is that you can't just bank on your optimal plan for each of your goals during your gap year. So let's say you establish 3 goals, one for fall, one for winter, and one for spring. Ideally, you've got your optimal plan. Maybe you want to study Spanish and you want to go down to Ecuador and be immersed in study abroad in Ecuador somewhere, or cultural immersion. Well, what happens if you can't go to Ecuador in the fall? It'd be a good idea to have a plan B, a more reasonable, practical backup. A good backup for studying Spanish in an immersed country might be going to Costa Rica, where students are currently allowed to go and be immersed as gap year age students, and pretty much with very few restrictions. And having a plan B backup for each one of your goals is going to be a really important priority for you as you go through your planning. The good news is that most facilitated gap year programs out there will have a plan A and probably a really good plan B for you to be able to choose from right in their own programming. But don't forget that step. We did not have to enact anybody's plan C, which is a virtual backup for students this year, because most students have been very considerate of putting together a really great plan A and then also a very solid plan B. And if you do that, you will not be caught unawares if things do change and move in a variable landscape that we're seeing based on COVID-19 in the next year. I'm going to turn it over to Erin, and I'll be available for questions later.
Thanks so much, Jason. That's really informative details, I think, to get from somebody who's been working with students who are providing, who are thinking about gap years from the last few years. So thank you for giving those tips to our attendees. Happy to be here tonight. My name is Erin Jensen. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Admissions at Washington State University, Vancouver, in Vancouver, Washington, just over the bridge from Portland, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest. And I've been working in the gap year policy world from the admissions standpoint for about 8 years now at a few different institutions. So this is something near and dear to my heart as an admissions counselor and as somebody who works with students thinking ahead to that first year of college. And one thing I've noticed in the last 8 years is that colleges across the US, and this is different in other countries, but especially in the US, have been relatively slow to the uptake of developing policies and ways to help students actually go about doing a gap year or deferring their admission for 1 year. There are often internal policies or internal practices for college admission related to deferral. But the COVID-19 pandemic actually really pushed a lot of colleges and universities to start thinking about how to respond to students who are asking about taking time off, and then how to support those students when they're ready to return to campus. And so, I think this slide here, hopefully you can see some of these things on your screen here, but these are results from a 2020 survey that the Gap Year Association conducted, which is actually an accreditation institution for gap year programming in the United States. They put a survey out to a lot of students who had done gap years and asked them, what sort of impacts do you feel your gap year has had on you as a college student? Now that you're in college, what do you think those experiences have done for you? And by and large, those experiences are the exact same sort of things that we in college admissions want to see students coming in and experiencing and adding to the college classes. So a lot of the soft skills in terms of maturity, resiliency, having a global perspective or a civic perspective, even hard skills such as another language or multiple languages, even professional experience from internship or volunteering. These students tend to have a higher GPA when they get to college, all the way through graduating typically in 4 years after having taken that gap year. And a lot of times they'll have a much clearer sense of what they want to study. They're going to be a lot more focused and able to really make good decisions about their academic pathways. And they're often more engaged on campus. So these are all really good qualities when an admissions counselor is considering an applicant to say, what will this student bring to this college environment? These are the things we want to see. So these are a lot of really good reasons for taking gap years, but also reasons why you can put yourself forward when you do apply for colleges to say, I'm choosing to take a gap year intentionally to do these things and to provide this sort of experience for myself and to the campus community. So go ahead to the next slide here. And so with that in mind, I just want to say that there are some definite pieces of advice that I would want to give those of you attending today from a college admissions standpoint. As Jason mentioned, the college admissions world has changed in the last few years. And especially so in the last year, a lot of you may have noticed that some of the selective institutions, colleges and universities in the country have started dropping the test score requirements, ACT or SAT requirements. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it had to do with inability to actually conduct those tests but there are a lot of other reasons related to inequities in standardized exams that I think were sort of on the periphery, and COVID-19 pushed it forward. So in many cases, the world of admission has changed a lot in the last year. And I think when you are considering a gap year and having an intentional plan between high school and college, the concepts of selling yourself to the institution from a sort of different perspective of it's not necessarily about good grades and good test scores. It's about those soft skills and those hard skills that you can provide to that college. But number one here, along with that, is to be intentional in having a plan between high school and college. There have been some students I've worked with who have said, COVID-19 really threw me for a loop. I just wasn't ready to start classes then, and I think I just need to take some time off, and I think I'm just gonna hang out at home. It's an okay reason to take a gap year, but you need to have a plan, right? So we want to hear, how are you going to be developing some of those skills that I just talked about that we want you to bring to a college environment? So Jason gave some really great examples of how you can start that planning process and come up with some of your whys and your goals. But we want to see that on an admissions application as well, perhaps in the essay sections if you have an opportunity to talk about your gap year. The other thing I want to point out is you have some options in terms of, do you apply now? Those of you who might be seniors in high school right now, do you apply to college and then defer your admission? Or do you want to go off on your experiential process of a gap year and then apply to college? You could actually do either of those two things. From my perspective, I encourage you to apply now, get admitted, and then either request to defer that admission. Sometimes you have to request it and get approved. And other times it's a little bit easier than that. And you can just say, I'd like to defer my admission, and you're good to go. But the reason I recommend that is because it does give you a lot more of that stability, knowing that you're admitted to at least one institution. They might ask you to say, put a deposit down and confirm to that college, in which case you will have to make that decision before you start your gap year period. But it will give you that structure when you return. I also encourage you to nurture a relationship with the admissions office of that college or university, especially because if your plans change during your gap year, you'll want to be able to go to someone and say, I'm not sure this is the right fit for me. Do you have other ideas for what I should do? Can I maybe change gears? That person's going to be one of your advocates and your resources along the way. When you are ready to return, I strongly encourage building a resume of sorts, a portfolio of what you've done and what some of those skills are. You might need that for applying for scholarships, for jobs on campus. And so that can be a really good way of summarizing what you've done in that gap year period. As you plan ahead for the fiscal aspect of going to college, I strongly encourage you to keep an eye out for scholarship opportunities, either nationally, regionally, or at the college where you're attending, that are geared towards students who've taken a gap year. They're few and far between, I will say that at this point, but they will probably start increasing as the years go on, because I think so many colleges are realizing the benefits of having gap year students on their campus. So keep an eye out for those. And if you really do need to present yourself to a college to say, I really have changed my mind, I want to attend this college or university, I know I took some time off, fall back on that portfolio, you have a chance to say why you would be a good fit for that college because you took a gap year. So think of it as a strengths-based case that you're making for admission as well. The last point that I wanted to touch on here, just a few things to keep in mind as you're considering your options with gap year programs. There are some structured programs that have college credit tied to them. That can be a really great option, especially if you want to bring some of that academic credit into your first year of college. However, there are many colleges and universities that will then make you reapply for admission, because that can change your admission type from freshman to transfer. We need to often evaluate that credit. The other thing I would say is applying to colleges mid-gap year can sometimes change the availability of financial aid or scholarship opportunities. So again, nurture that relationship with your admissions officer, make sure you have open conversations, stay in touch, and I think we've all said it at this point, be intentional and have a plan. So those are some tips from a real-life admissions officer. And I'm hoping we can maybe pass it off to Molly. I believe she's up next. Let's see if she is with us. Molly, are you there?
Thanks, Erin. I don't think Molly was able to connect, unfortunately, but Jason just going to real quickly cover her experience in her gap time and tell us a little bit about what Molly did.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And Molly sends her regrets. She really tried hard in all the avenues to make it onto this call, just not working. So I met Molly about a year and a half ago and started working with her to help plan her gap year. And Molly is a pretty serious athlete and she's really interested in sports. And so sports and being very active were a main goal of hers, if you will, during her gap time. When we initially started talking, she thought maybe she would stay closer to home during her gap year. She thought that maybe she was actually going to do back to back semester programs, one in the fall and one in the winter and spring. And one of the things I love about Molly's example is it just shows how much growth can happen for a student during their gap time. So Molly did end up going on a group facilitated gap year semester in the fall. She went with an organization called Adventures Cross Country. Molly's from the East Coast. She wanted to see the West Coast and spend time involved in community service, environmental conservation. There was some fun adventure travel built in. And that group got very close. And Molly made some amazing connections with the students from that program. She had an amazing experience. She wrote me afterwards and said, this was really kind of life-changing for me in terms of my own leadership qualities and what I want to focus on in school, which is exactly what you want to hear out of a great facilitated program. She also emailed to say, that program that I had signed up for the winter and spring, I don't think I want to do it. I don't think I need to have that programmatic experience a second time. And I don't want to actually corrupt the amazing experience that I just had by joining a different group. What if it's not the same? I think I'd like to do something more independent. I'm going to stay near home and I'm going to work at a cross country ski center in Vermont. She's from Boston. And so she wanted to go up to Vermont and she's a big cross country skier. And so she did. She spent part of the winter working at this cross country ski center, making money, doing rentals, teaching ski lessons. And then ultimately, she was called by one of the students who was a part of her initial group from the fall, who said, I'm going to Hawaii. I'm going to do some volunteer work there. Would you like to come? A few other GAP students and I are going to get a place together. We're going to rent out some cheap apartment and we're all going to stay there and do some volunteer work, working with kids, working in the environment. And this is a student who organized this for all of these other GAP year students. So Molly was calling in from Hawaii, doing some of this amazing work. And you can see right there, there's a shot from where she's staying in Hawaii. So one of the things I love about Molly's story is that she came into gap year with a lot of specific ideas, a lot of thoughts that she might need certain things. She might need a group the entire way through. She might need facilitation in her process the whole way through. But what she found is that some of her other interests came out, her confidence came out, she built up lots of independence and maturity. And so her gap year started progressing from a group-based experience into something that felt familiar, but was a stretch, right? Working at this cross-country ski center was familiar, but it was also a stretch to work and live on her own. And then she went off and lived independently with this group of peers, doing this very self-organized volunteering experience. And I love Molly's example because she's about to go off to college in the fall, feeling very empowered and like she's had a lot of diversity of activities during her gap time. When I think about Erin in her admissions role, I think about students like Molly, and Molly's going to a wonderful school and she got into a great university. She was already a shoo-in to be successful there. And yet look at all these other skills that she's bringing to the college landscape now. I mean, her school is so lucky to have her after this time. And that's exactly what we want to see coming out of a gap year.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason, for covering Molly's experience. I wish you could join us, but that was a really good overview of what she did, and it sounds incredible. So thanks again for that. Thank you, Erin and Jason, both. And let's move on to Q&A. So it looks like we have a couple questions in the queue, which is great. Thank you so much for submitting those. But now is a good time. If you have a question you have yet to submit, please do, because we're just going to go down the list here and get some expert opinions. So let's start off. It looks like we have a mother in the crowd who has a question about her daughter. So Mary is asking, I think my daughter should take a gap year, but she is worried that she will miss out or be too old when she goes back to school. How do you recommend I help her through those thoughts? I think, Jason, you've got plenty of experience with that, huh?
Yeah, we definitely hear that question most often from students and parents who are concerned about that. I really appreciate it. It's a real concern. I understand that young adults have essentially been tracked with their peers for their entire lives, and that's what elementary and high school education really creates. I think as adults, all of us know that kind of the moment we graduate high school, it's all on our own timeline, right? Some of your daughter's peers are going to go straight through college in 4 years, and some of them are going to take 6 years, and some of them are going to transfer schools, and some of them might drop out and never finish, and some of them might do study abroad and it's going to take them an extra semester, and others might go right into the working world, and others might have a family member who gets ill and have to step away completely. There's just so many things that can happen in our young adult life. And one of the things that I know that at least we try and share with students is that gap time is really about you taking hold of the pacing and the learning of your own life at the speed that you're ready for. College is going to be there, and it's going to be ready for you when you're really excited and ready to be there too. I have a lot of students who will take gap time in the fall, really worried about how they're going to reconnect with their college age peers. And then they come home for the holidays and everybody gathers together in a typical year. And, their friends are sharing experiences and stories about, oh, I'm taking this class and that class, and I got to go to this party and I got to join this club. And then they're like, what did you do? And that student's like, I went to Ecuador and I lived in that amazing rural community because my goal was Spanish immersion. And I got to go to Machu Picchu and hike on the Inca Trail in Peru to get there. And also, I'm also going to get to go to college and have all those amazing experiences too. And that's an amazing thing. I think a lot of gap year students inspire their peers to study abroad or to step away and get that hands-on learning as well. So I know that for the students that we work with, it is a real worry, but that we try and just share that the pathway of their lives is really opening up in front of them, and that you as parents can really encourage that as well. You want them to be healthy and well and successful, and stepping away from the college landscape in this moment to take gap time doesn't mean you're going to be behind your peers. It just means you're going to have more inspiration to share with them.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. I think that's a very, very thorough answer. And again, a very common question. So good deal. Aaron, it looks like this one is for you. We have an attendee out there who is asking, if I defer my acceptance, what are the chances they approve? Do most schools allow gap years?
Yeah, that's a really common question that we get from the admissions side of the house. And I would say in general, I don't want to speak for all colleges and universities. It is very unique to each college and university admissions office. What I can tell you from my perspective is if I'm looking at a student who was admitted, say you apply now, get admitted for fall 2021, academics are there, what that student is bringing to the college is there. What we're going to be most interested in is your academic history changing at all during the time that you're taking a gap year? And if it is, let's talk about how we can evaluate that in the future, i.e. college credit, right? And then if it isn't, then what are you going to do during that time that will, ultimately still make you a good fit for the college or university? Some of those soft skills that we talked about earlier. So the likelihood, the times where I've seen a student's gap year request not necessarily move forward is if they weren't detailed enough or not intentional enough in their description of what they plan to do. We will often go back and say, tell us a little bit more. What do you want to get out of this time frame? How will this enrich your college experience? It's usually not a flat, like, sorry, no, you have to reapply later. It's more like, just let's think through this a little bit more, because ultimately we want you to come to our college or university and we want to help you get there. And we'll often help you make that process happen along the way. I think it's going to probably be more likely that a private, more selective institution would be open to gap year experiences, because typically the admission criteria is more holistic, right? There's usually an essay required, something where you're providing maybe letters of recommendation or a resume of some kind. So that's where you really have a chance to say, here's my whole package of who I am and what I plan to be doing. And that can be really beneficial when it comes to having a gap year process approved. Where it might be a little bit harder are those sort of larger public institutions or larger private colleges that you might just really need to, again, nurture that relationship with an admissions counselor. Make sure they know who you are and what your purpose is. And I still feel like the likelihood of being accepted for a gap year to move forward and maintain that admission status would be greater than not. In some instances, you may need to reapply, but if you were admitted before and your academic, your whole academic profile is the same, there's really no reason to not admit you the next year if it's one of those institutions that's not really selective. So I want to give you that sort of confidence that if you are asking for that, it's more likely than not that you would be approved for a gap year.
Right. I think that's very helpful. And the two things that I heard you say that are just really hit home are the intention and the opportunity for growth and development. How are you going to use this time? I think that is very helpful. Thank you, Erin. It looks like we have several questions covering about the same topics. I'm going to kind of group a couple of these together. The first one is, what is a typical cost of a gap year? Can I use 529 funding? And then with that, kind of on the same note, any advice for taking a gap year with minimal funds? So, Jason, you probably have experience here, navigating the minimal funds portion and the 529 portion. So, you want to take that one?
Sure. It's a really good question. And I think a lot of times families limit the gap year conversation just flat out because they think it's going to cost more than they have available. Who's saved for a gap year, right? That's not something that most parents have done. And so there actually there's quite a range of costs for gap year based experiences. But what I want everyone to take away from this is that we've worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students, many with very small budgets for the year. About the amount that it would cost to clothe and feed your child for the year is what the family can offer to them. And we've seen families come up with some very creative and compelling gap time experiences with even minimal budgets. So don't let money be the thing that stops this conversation, because there's a lot of ways to get creative. What are some of those ways? So first of all, there's a very robust source of work exchange options that are out there in the world. These are opportunities where, in exchange for, say, your labor of 20 hours a week, you can go and live on an organic farm or on a vineyard or at a retreat center or at a camp. And your labor helps provide for you housing and food. And so it's a very fair deal where gap year age students get to go, oftentimes with peers their own age. Good example is like going to Hawaii and working on a beautiful organic farm somewhere where you've got half your day spent working and doing some nice farming, and then half the day is spent getting a chance to go to the beach or go do a hike or do something else you're excited about. Those options tend to be cost neutral because you're not really paying for anything and you might not be making money. There are a number of opportunities for gap year students also to make money. You can go to countries like Australia and New Zealand if and when they open up again and get working holiday visas and go work while you're there and make some money. You can work in the ski-based industries here in the United States very easily and get housing included and also get paid. And then some gap year students will use some of their gap time at home in order to work and save up some money and then apply that money to the gap year experiences they want. If you are looking at facilitated gap year programs, a semester of a facilitated gap year program could be anywhere between $12,000 and say $17,000, usually centering more on the $13,000 to $15,000 range. But you should also know that there's a lot of low-cost volunteering out there, low-cost internship opportunities, low-cost skills courses. And so there's many ways to kind of amortize out the overall cost of a gap year by having maybe one experience you really want to invest in that's costly, and the rest of the gap year made up of low-cost or no-cost experiences. And Erin, I don't know if you can speak more to the 529 piece, but I would love to just hear your thoughts about how 529s have played out with college credit. I'm happy to take it if you like to, kind of.
Yeah, I can add a little bit about that. I have had some experience with students using 529 plans. These are typically educational plans, sort of like a savings plan that a parent might invest money in over time, and then it's intended to be used towards tuition, typically at a college or university. Most states, it's really different depending on each state and how they set up those types of plans, but most of them are going to have some sort of restriction that a student show proof of being enrolled in college credit in order to apply those funds towards whatever program that student's involved in. I've seen most luck using those funds towards actual guided programs, as Jason just mentioned, the actual guided, facilitated programs that have some sort of college credit associated with them. So that might be almost like when you do study abroad in college, there's usually what we call it in the sector is a school of record. It's a college or university that actually puts those classes or those credits on a transcript that can then be sent over to wherever else to transfer that credit. So if there is a program that has that type of college credit aspect, potentially the 529 plan funds could be used to pay for part of those programs. Again, though, I would say it's going to depend on the state and the qualifications for those specific funds. I would also recommend maybe being in touch with the study abroad offices within the college that is awarding that credit. So if you know that, for instance, Portland State University is awarding college credit for this program, reach out to the study abroad program there, because they will be most familiar with how 529 plans can be used, especially for international abroad programs, but maybe for domestic as well. Does anything else to add, Jason?
I think that was great. We're lucky and that the Gap Year Association, which you and I are both really involved with, has championed this idea of credit for gap year programs, and their relationship with Portland State University has made the use of 529s much more accessible for gap year students.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. Okay, moving on. We have two more questions. If you have any questions, submit them now. I feel like this could be our last call for questions here. We have an attendee asking, is there a list of non-US destination programs that are allowing US students to travel this summer or this fall? So Jason, probably the best one to field this one, but what I do want to do is just drop a link to our digital guide, because the digital guide is so helpful. It has over, oh my goodness, I think maybe 40 or 50 programs listed in that guide. And they really break out, what these programs do, where they go, who they're open to, and kind of gives a description of each one. So that's really helpful. Also want to plug the final fair, our gap year fair on March 30th. We will have over 30 programs at that fair to interact and engage with you all. So definitely join us for that event. But Jason, do you know of any list like this that we have out there, maybe floating away? Maybe GYA has something, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think that USA Gap Year Fairs is one of the most curated lists. The Gap Year Association, which we can drop a link to that as well, has a list of the programs that have gone through accreditation, meaning they have gone through a very serious process of vetting by the Gap Year Association on the quality of their programming. Any organization that has been awarded that accreditation, is very high quality. And so you can see a number of programs there, also a number of programs that are in process. And just because they are in process doesn't mean they're not already high quality. It's just a lengthy process. So we can look at the Gap Year Association as well. It is difficult to know right now what's going to happen with international destinations. Programs are being very careful and very wary. Many of them have curtailed their travel itineraries from, say, 3 countries down to 1, so that they don't get caught in a scenario where borders could close in multiple situations. So there's a lot that's happening, but programs that are offering programming right now, the best question you can just ask is, well, why are you feeling confident about going to this destination? And ultimately, do you see any potential challenges with going to that destination, either politically or based on COVID right now? I've seen some destinations that certain programs have put up that I'm wondering how that will be possible that they could go there, but most organizations seem pretty on target with the countries that are currently allowing Americans, or that would likely allow Americans who have been vaccinated or at least have the negative test.
Yep. Good deal. And thank you, Aaron, for dropping that link in the chat for everyone to check out. Our final question of the evening is asking, are there any gap year options for students who need support with executive functioning skills? So very common question again. The answer is yes. Jason, I'm sure you could take us away on this. You're the expert here.
Thanks. There are programs that are designated for students with lots of brain related considerations. So we have students who have ADD, ADHD, who have levels of anxiety, executive functioning. There are 2 programs very specifically that are dedicated to this, and a program that is going to be launching this fall, the Foreman School, which will be really supporting students who are working with these considerations. But 2 other organizations you may want to look at would be Broad Futures, as well as SOAR, Gap Year, SOAR. Those 3 programs are very specifically going to be creating programming and pacing that's appropriate for students who are really wanting to work on these skill sets. Now, that being said, most gap year programs, by their inherent nature of being experiential and not necessarily classroom based, by allowing students to take on larger leadership opportunities and to learn and grow in teams that are working collaboratively together, they're going to help support executive functioning and many other skill set building. So we found that lots of students that we're working with who have a diagnosis around executive functioning are doing really well in typical gap year programming. So have a look at those 3 organizations, but know that lots of other programs will support students, particularly if the pacing of that program allows for students to really take a breath and work on those skill sets, and the mentorship is really there.
Great point. Well, thank you so much, Jason. Those are great recommendations. And I just want to take the time to say thank you again, Aaron and Jason, for joining us. Always a pleasure. I will go ahead and this will be recorded and will be shared to all of our registration. So anyone who missed it tonight, don't worry. We will send out to your family or students or parents, whoever they may be. Thank you again, Jason, for dropping those links, and Aaron. And let's move on to our final slide of the evening. Go ahead and get that pulled up. And on this last slide, I just wanted to take a second to kind of talk through our upcoming events, because we do have several thematic panels, as mentioned earlier on in the call. And I just want to kind of point out that these are going to range. They're going to be very topic specific, be very focused on one theme or another. For example, we have, gap year in the arts, we have career exploration, internships, teaching abroad, and those types of experiences. We have actually on Wednesday, just this week, we have how to plan your gap year. So now if you're thinking this is what you want to do, now what's next? How do I move forward? That may be a good one to join. And here we have our calendar of kind of upcoming events. And again, that final fair on March 30th. So I'll go ahead and I'll just drop one final time this link in the chat to all of our future events. And then that way you can sign up for anything that interests you, whatever kind of suits your fancy. So thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it tonight, and I hope you have a great evening. And again, thank you to our wonderful panelists, and we will see you next time. Bye, everyone.